All right, it's no secret that Republicans hold little sway in Massachusetts state government. Democrats, though, dominate both the House and Senate, of course.
Still not keeping Minority Leader Bruce Tarr from trying to impact the process. So he sat down with our Matt Prichard to detail his goals and the impact of the Trump administration.
Senate Minority Leader Bruce Tarr, thanks for joining us on a Sunday.
Well, Matt, it's great to be with you on a Sunday, and it's even better to be with you on a Sunday here at Maritime Gloucester in my hometown in a very historic location.
We're here today. We're talking a little bit about what's happening at the State House this coming week, particularly the budget debate, the Senate putting forward their initial budget for the fiscal year 26. How do you just sort of view the overall top-line number and the things we've heard from Senate Democrats?
Part of the concern for this year is the amount of increase in the budget. It's going up by about 6.3%. And given what we're seeing in terms of uncertainty at the federal level, the potential for an economic downturn, there are a lot of concerns, and I think justifiable concerns.
I spoke with Senate President Karen Spilka a few weeks ago. She said, no new taxes. We need to be making sure we're cutting down on spending because of uncertainty at the federal level and here at the state with revenues. Do you sort of buy that narrative that Democrats are putting out that they're trying to curb spending?
Well, I agree with the fact that we need to curb spending, and we might have some differences about how we curb that spending, but I think the fact that there are new taxes proposed in this budget is very important, and that's something that we welcome.
What specifically can we expect to see from the Republican caucus?
Probably the most important one is funding for our K through 12 education systems, because the problem is right now in many communities they are receiving something called minimum per pupil aid, which means that they are getting from the state the minimum amount of aid increase that's contemplated by the law. Now, this year, that's $104 per student. In the Senate version of the budget that's been proposed by the Ways and Means Committee, that number goes to $150 per student. It is still far too low.
What number would you like to see for students?
We're proposing $200 minimum per pupil aid. We'd like it to be higher, but we also are realistic, and we know that a more substantial increase is probably beyond reach because it would be inconsistent with our other mission of trying to contain state spending.
Do you think your Democratic colleagues are willing to listen to these changes you're proposing, or does it feel like you're just yelling into the void?
Even though we are in the distinct minority, there is a bipartisan conversation that happens about priorities like education, and we certainly are having that conversation about minimum per pupil aid. We're having that conversation about reforming the budget formula in Chapter 70 for school aid. So there's a conversation. Hopefully we're able to prevail because we try to find common ground when we can. And so call me an optimist, Matt, but I am always there to try to work with folks that might have a different perspective or a different opinion.
I wanted to ask you about another part of the budget, which was trying to increase the budget for the Attorney General as she has been filing numerous lawsuits. Is that important in your mind?
You know, it's important that the Attorney General be properly funded. Micromanaging the Attorney General is also not something that we should be doing or that I would be interested in. But I think at some point you have to look at how those funds are being appropriated, how much is going toward fighting what's happening in Washington, and how much is going toward the very serious issues that we have locally. And that's something where I think we need to have more of a conversation about where the resources are going if there's going to be an increase.
You said something interesting there about the difference between focusing on what's happening in Washington and what's happening here at the state. Senate President Spilka has tasked the Steering and Policy Committee to focus in on some of these issues. What do you make of sort of giving that committee that specific drive and task?
So the Steering and Policy Committee, and I'm the ranking minority member on that committee, has always been charged with identifying legislation that should move through the flow. And I do think it makes sense in light of what we're seeing nationally for us to take a look at what some of the impacts could be and try to be as proactive as possible to try to respond to those impacts. And so if we're talking about, for instance, cuts to Medicaid, which are probably the biggest threat to destabilizing our state budget, we should be looking at that and trying to understand what we can do to mitigate it. What we need to be careful about, Matt, is getting the understanding or creating the assumption that we have the ability in state government to potentially offset every cut that the federal government could make. We do not.
Moving on now over to rules. I know that the legislature has been looking at a new set of joint rules, but it seems like there has been a lot of hand-wringing, a lot of problems so far trying to come to consensus. How are you sort of viewing this argument and how it's unfolding?
So I'm deeply concerned about it because this is the first time in many years that we've had an opportunity to achieve some meaningful rules reform that will increase transparency. What I really want folks to understand is what's at risk. The rules are the infrastructure of transparency. And if we don't build the strongest infrastructure we can, then transparency suffers.
You sort of see this as supermajority dysfunction? Is that how you describe it?
Well, I see it more as a rivalry between the branches and a difficulty in trying to find common ground, even as each branch has proposed some very meaningful changes to increase transparency. And while both are controlled by supermajorities, I think the bigger problem is that those supermajorities in the conference committee, as they're represented, not being able to find a way forward.
Let's move from Beacon Hill and head into your district. A couple of really key stories and headlines that have come out of this area, including sand replenishment. It seemed like things were moving in a forward direction, and then some delays came up at the beginning of this year. So can you sort of tell us where we're at with this?
I'm pleased to report that it did finish on time, but it finished only after we were able to secure some additional funding. And we were all able to work together and convince the Healy-Driscoll administration that we needed the extra funding, and the governor agreed with that proposition. We were able to get the extra funding in the nick of time so that we didn't have to suspend the project for a long period of time. The sand was placed, and as we would have predicted, it's actually caused a natural accretion that's gained us more volume than we paid for in terms of the project.
Is the hope here that this is a permanent solution, or is that just sort of a wait and see if it is a permanent solution?
It is acknowledged as a measure that provides a quantum of protection. Some of the sand that's involved will clearly move. Some of it will be sacrificial, but it will not be a permanent solution. And so the way that this needs to be treated is that it was a very important step to take, but it was only a step.
Let's move off the sand now and now into the ocean. Obviously, NOAA fishing, a huge part of this community and your district. Talk me through the beginning days of the Trump administration and the possibility that fishing may have been curtailed quite a bit.
There's been a very concerning set of rules developed that have not yet been implemented. And one of the radical things that those rules do is take the cod stock in New England, which is traditionally two stocks, Georges Bank and Gulf of Maine, and separating them into four stocks. But the difficulty is, and where we were at the brink of a disaster, was that the federal fishing year begins on May 1st. And those rules that have been proposed by the New England Fishery Management Council but not yet approved by NOAA had no decision. And without a decision, there could be no fishing starting on May 1st. And we communicated to the administration that this was not a consequence that should be allowed to happen. And so fortunately, the administration implemented an emergency action to allow fishing to continue. So there's a lot at stake here.
Senator Tarr, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Great to be with you, Matt, and happy Sunday.
All right, good stuff there from Matt.